Hello, my name is Michael Sweeney, and this is the NABE episode 3. Now, I don't want to alarm anyone, but someone on the internet wrote a bad article about gentrification. I know. It's the first time this has ever happened, so I thought we needed to talk about it. The article in question is The Mount Pleasant Miracle: How One DC Neighborhood Quietly Became a National Model for Resisting Gentrification by Jefferson Morley, published in the Washington Post magazine, January 25th. This article has generated a ton of discussion online. A lot of people are talking about it. I felt like we should talk about it as well. Alex Baca is the policy manager at Greater Washington and a white person who complains on the internet. Alex is also a longtime Mount Pleasant resident and is going to explain to us exactly what's going on in this article. One final note before we get started, I wanted to tell you that we record this show with my big dumb dog in the room. You can unfortunately hear him early in the episode whining in the background. It's a little bit distressing to hear a dog whine. I want to reassure you that he is fine. He's just mad when no one is paying attention to him. So sorry about that. And anyway, without further ado, here's my interview with Alex. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for using my suggested descriptor as a white person who complains on the internet. I look forward to talking to you today about complaints on the internet.
So this article has been passed around a lot, and there were kind of like a lot of eyebrow-raising passages in it for me. But let's start with the overall premise, which is that Mount Pleasant in Washington, D.C. is a model for preventing gentrification. What is wrong with the premise of this article?
Okay, so I'm gonna do a bit that I'm really excited about. So I'm on vacation, and it's 12:10 where I am. So I'm drinking this beautiful Amaro by Four Tab Spirits. That's from some like crazy small batch distiller in Brooklyn. It has like a plague mask on it. It's dope. Delicious Amaro. Cheers. So I bought this at the liquor store across the street from me in Mount Pleasant, which is mentioned in this piece as being a sort of like work-a-day liquor store, which is like, it's true. You can buy plenty of like PBR and like, $9 bottles of wine or whatever, but they also have this like incredible natural wine selection, new Amaras every week, like really great, like best vermouth selection, urban wine and spirits. It's fucking awesome. I love it. Like it's the liquor store that you get in a gentrified neighborhood when people like me live across the street and like are willing to spend money on that. So, there's a lot that's wrong with this article, but I think the way that I would sum it up is that it is like absolutely ludicrous to write a piece asserting that Mount Pleasant has resisted gentrification and make that argument on the basis of these sort of aesthetic signifiers and consumptive tendencies. When the aesthetic signifiers and consumptive tendencies of Mount Pleasant, despite what's included in here, is like really, really, really bougie and really, really, really like scans as white at this point because like whiteness and wealth are so tightly correlated in the US.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely doesn't seem like, reading the article, even by its own terms, it doesn't seem like a neighborhood that's resisted gentrification. It seems like a post-gentrification neighborhood that is mostly inhabited by extremely wealthy white people.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think the sort of thing, the most Mount Pleasant thing is like being the sort of self-conscious, like intentional community white person, like that is making the choice to follow these like to consume things that do signify like a sort of like more downscale like kind of approach. Like that in its own way is like, to me, actually it's just like more dishonest even than like a lot of like, just annoying, like, I don't know, lobbyists, investment bankers, like whoever the you want to like say is a terrible person who lives in like a high-rise glass condo. Like, I think it's just disingenuous to pretend that like just because you are a do-gooder, like a legitimate phrase that this piece uses is like do-gooders, like white anti-poverty lawyers, government workers, like that kind of thing. I think it's really disingenuous to say that just because you shop at Best World, like that your neighborhood has resisted gentrification. Just because El Progreso and El West are still there, like doesn't mean that Mount Pleasant has resisted gentrification. It probably means that the operators own their buildings.
So yeah, it's kind of like an open question to me reading this article to what degree this is like actively dishonest versus kind of naive. I mean, this writer, I hadn't heard of him. He seems like he's someone who does not write on housing or real estate or issues like this very often. He's like has a JFK conspiracy theory blog of all things. But there definitely seem to be some things in the article that seem at least extremely taken out of context.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I didn't read the piece initially. It was very funny. I got like a bunch of pings from my friends who knew this stuff as like bait for me, and like that were just like hot, terrible take on gentrification in Mount Pleasant, the neighborhood that you live in. And I was again doing a bit because I'm on vacation, so I'm just like full of bits, and was like, I'm not gonna read it, but I'm gonna tweet a bunch of judgmental things about it. I thought my tweet thread actually turned out pretty good, but all of that is to say, I did read the article in preparation for this, and some of the positive commentary on it was like, well, this is a really loving portrait of the neighborhood, but it's not. It's like a list of like my dad's things to do. Like, it's not even like a particularly like well written article. I would say that there's no like literal falsehoods in it, but there's a lot that's left out.
Right, like a lot of dishonesty by omission.
Like, yeah, and there's a lot of just like, you know, I know that you and I have certainly participated in a lot of conversations about this, but it does really feel like the like degrowthers solution to gentrification, like, is that like Mount Pleasant is this like super static, like never changing neighborhood with like a fixed number of people, like finite number of businesses, and like so therefore it can only be like this variety of like basically like goods and services that are indicating like how fancy the neighborhood is or isn't, which like as I sort of said at the top of this is bullshit, because this entire article like basically tries to defend all of this like businessy sort of like consumptive aesthetic kind of thing, and like rests its argument in that one. That's like not true at all. Mount Pleasant has like a fancy cookbook store now. Like, I mean, where the do you get a fancy cookbook store? That used to be a coffee shop and now it's a cookbook store. And I look forward to buying cookbooks at the cookbook store, but like, come on.
Yeah, and the retail businesses loom really large in this article. You know, there's like multiple paragraphs about this CVS that was apparently trying to open, and then I mean, it's very amusing to me the way it's presented in the article, where it's like, oh, there was a rumor that there was a CVS that was going to be started, so they gathered signatures, like 1,000 signatures, and then apparently that fought off the CVS from taking over this local business. But it's also like there's a CVS 2 blocks outside of the neighborhood, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you want to tell yourself that 1,000 petition signatures both fought off the CVS, but also somehow saved Don Juan's and Mount Pleasant Pharmacy across the street, like that's just like a really convenient narrative to not have to engage with any actual realities of how this stuff works. Like, I'm fairly sure that the CVS like wasn't stopped. It just didn't go. You know, Mount Pleasant is in a historic district, and like I would say that if you're a like, I don't know, crazy gajillion, like honestly, like super ghoulish national pharmacy chain, and you're looking to do things like as quickly and easily as possible, like you're probably fine with the fact that there's 2 CVSs within a 10-minute walk of Mount Pleasant Street. You know, the building is a weird building. The ingress and egress is weird. Doing anything in a historic district is a gigantic pain in the ass. So like, you know, all credit to the people who feel really good about signing a petition and feeling like it saves the neighborhood. But like, I truly don't think that is what did it. I think like people should, if they didn't want to CVS in Mount Pleasant, like feel lucky that like it wasn't convenient for CVS to open up, because I really think it's just that. So it's just a really, really like, I don't know. It's like, oh, my personal experience with the neighborhood is therefore what the neighborhood is, which is like really unfair to a bunch of people who like you're never going to talk to and are never going to freelance for the Post, are never going to be on a podcast like talking about this stuff, like normal humans who don't spend their lives thinking about all of this, which honestly sounds like lovely. Who knows what their Mount Pleasant is, and if they care about the CVS or the Best World or Each Peach or the fancy cookbook store or the place that now sells $21 pizzas. Like, I don't know. Like, I would say overall, like, I care more about having like access to services, affordable housing, and like letting people live dignified lives with support of the government. Like, and some of that, there is a strong nonprofit base in Mount Pleasant that the article goes into, but that's also like, again, in a way, sort of like depending on like philanthropy to do the work of government in keeping neighborhoods integrated.
Yeah, and to me that seemed like it was like, I guess, the least problematic or the least wrong part of the article, where this you know more about this than I do, but this law that allows apartment residents to buy their buildings and convert them into co-ops. I mean, that seems great as far as I can tell.
It's great. TOPA is great, and DC is so lucky to have TOPA. I mean, I believe that San Francisco, like 2 years ago, was considering some sort of like opportunity to purchase bill. We've had TOPA since the 70s. Dave Clark, who is the Ward 1 council member, gets like a lot of airtime in this piece, but Dave Clark was a really wonderful man. But I think you do need to place him in the context of like the larger first DC council. So it's story time. When DC was granted home rule in 1973, and the city was kind of figuring out how to be a city, how to be a government, how to self-govern. The first council was like full of activists like Thurleen Tucker and Marion Barry and Dave Clark were all like on the first DC council. I am actually blanking on the name of the first chairman, but there's this like wonderful quote from him that's just like, I had to like basically tell like the activists who had spent so much of their lives fighting the man that they were the man now. And that's kind of what the first DC council was. But from that sort of like anti-establishment, like pro-resident and really sort of self-determination thing, because DC is not a state and we are taxed without representation, came a lot of, I think, like very strong housing policies that frankly work better over time anyway. So like we have the rent stabilization legislation that we have because it was established like in the 70s and refined in the 80s, and like we're still talking about that. We have TOPA, we have like this sort of setup of like, we have more of an infrastructure of that because it started in the 70s, and that was a deliberate choice by that council, which is great. And so yes, TOPA is really, really valuable. However, in recent years, it's been cut back. Recently, the council actually made it not apply to single family houses, which is a big bummer. So tenants no longer have like first right of refusal for single family houses. And TOPA deals are also hard. I think that's a big thing to talk about. We don't do tenant organizing at GG Wash, but we do obviously work a lot with like development and understanding what that system looks like and how to make those land use policies better. And TOPA is such an important tool, but it's very, very hard to organize a building. It's hard. It's so hard that, in some cases it fails. And it failed in the building that I live in. So my building is a failed TOPA deal. The tenants were not able to organize and were not able to buy the building. Several nonprofits were also interested in purchasing the building. It was too expensive at that time. So I live in a unit that I'm pretty sure somebody was kind of like agitated out of because it's a rent controlled building, but you can reset to market rate in DC when somebody leaves the unit.
No vacancy control, right?
No vacancy control. And so my unit is lovely. I live on Mount Pleasant Street. I really enjoy being proximate to amenities, but like TOPA deals that work are only half the story, because if TOPA deals are no longer working in really wealthy neighborhoods such as Mount Pleasant, to the extent that the buildings are then too expensive for nonprofits to buy when tenants can't organize, that's a policy problem that needs changing. So we can't just sit here and like be like, oh, Mount Pleasant resisted gentrification because there's co-ops. Like, if you leave your apartment building or leave your co-op in Mount Pleasant, you're probably not moving within Mount Pleasant. And if you are, you're probably white, probably pretty affluent, if not like cash rich. Like, you probably have a lot of social capital. And again, I can speak to that because I lived in Mount Pleasant in multiple locations for most of my adult life.
Right, exactly. It's like, I mean, it's one of the curious things about this article is like, it's actually pretty upfront about laying out some of these facts about how the racial mix of the neighborhood has changed over the years, and about there's this one passage about the Fenty family, with the parents of the former mayor of Washington D.C., which, I don't know, it's a strange choice to be an illustrative example, but it says they paid $30,000
friends with the Fenties and then interviewed them. That's what this. I also like. I just want to say, like, as a sidebar, I don't think this is a well-written article. I do not think it's a good portrait of the neighborhood, and it really reads as like, it's just like some guy kind of talking about his experience in Mount Pleasant. Like, it's also just like, it's from like a media criticism perspective, which, another sidebar, I am so excited. I get to like pounce all over an article. Like, it feels very like sane and normal and like 2012. But like, it does just really feel like this guy like tapped the things that he does and the people that he knows and like wrote about it.
Yeah, they seem like most of the people profile, they're like probably personal friends of his. It doesn't seem like a very well reported article. It's like, I think he lives in the neighborhood and talked to his friends.
When I file stuff like that, it gets sent back to me and I have to rewrite it.
So this little passage about the Fenties, he does like a little profile of them, but then later in the article he says, the kind of row houses that the likes of Jan and Phil Fenty paid $30,000 for back in the 1970s now sell for $900,000, which, I mean, also like looking at the Zillow listings might be kind of an underestimate of what the row houses in Mount Pleasant sell for these days. But that is gentrification. A $30,000 row house selling for $900,000. Like, the problem with this article is that Mount Pleasant is gentrified. Beyond gentrified. It's
beyond gentrified. People have already like said their piece about Mount Pleasant being gentrified. You know, there are some books in my tweet thread about this. Brett Williams' Upscaling Downtown came out in 1998. Gabriella Modin's book, Turf Wars, came out in 2006. I was reminded by my friends that Ian MacKay, who's described as a homeowner in Mount Pleasant, which is like hilarious.
Famous celebrity, Fugazi and other musical projects. I mean, this is almost like a cliche. Like, you would hear this about like Williamsburg or like Austin, Texas a lot, where there would be some 90s or 80s musician who had bought a house there and was now like popping up as a NIMBY homeowner. I mean, I don't know if Ian is NIMBY particularly, but it was so funny to stumble across that in the article and be like, oh, that guy.
Yeah, I mean, there are some like old head cranks in the neighborhood, but I will say that like most of my like punk heroes in Mount Pleasant have not really shown up as like the hardcore NIMBYs, and I respect them for that. And I hope if any of them have like secret anti-condo tendencies, that they just like keep that to like writing like sad albums about it and not actually coming to ANC meetings.
So yeah, it's like the part of the article that I think was maybe, I don't know if I want to give it that much credit, but the history of Mount Pleasant that they go over is actually pretty interesting, where it was a streetcar suburb that had a racial covenant in it that forbid people of color from buying houses there. And then, sort of goes through this mid-century period of disinvestment and Black and Hispanic families moving in. And then since the 90s especially has become, well, I mean, it's become gentrified. There have been several waves of gentrification until we get to our current status where there's, $1.2 million houses there. Something that they didn't mention in the article, which I found out by reading about it online a little bit, is that it's apparently like part of the school zone for Northwestern D.C. and not the same school zone as Columbia Heights and the other less upscale neighborhoods around it.
Shout out to a friend of mine who also texted me about this article to say that Mount Pleasant was gentrified when Bancroft was turned into the feeder system for Deal and Wilson, which is a mouthful of like DC school jumble. But what that does mean is that, I think I want to say, I don't know if you checked this, was it in like the 90s that like that feeder system was rerouted? Because kids in Mount Pleasant go to Wilson, they don't go to, it used to be Bell Multicultural, now it's Columbia Heights Education Campus, which is it's closer. It's a lot closer. It's across the street. It's, where my polling place is. It's where there's a lot of public meetings because it's close to the neighborhood. But Wilson is not. But Wilson is, Wilson's the nice, good high school in Upper Northwest. It's the good public school.
Where the rich people in D.C., the public school that they can send their kids to and not have to go to private school.
Yeah, not have to go to private school, but I will say, big shouts to the Ward 3 parents who actually don't think Wilson is good enough and send their kids to like St. Albans anyway. So, that happens. That's love to pay my double tax.
So it's like, there's this history of policy interventions in Mount Pleasant that maybe have gone a little bit the other way in terms of making the neighborhood less diverse and making the neighborhood explicitly catering to white people in a way that the article sort of just like glides over as if these were things that happened, in the distant past.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to gloss over the sort of like, it feels nice and diverse in Mount Pleasant. Of course it does, compared to like Cleveland Park, or Chevy Chase. I don't want to erase the fact that there are some very cool, very long-standing businesses there, and some of the longtime leaders of the neighborhood are just like, very much out of the civil rights movement and have a very collective spirit. I think that that's why people like living there, and that's where you get that sort of like what is described as like intentionality and community making, and like that is lovely. That stuff is really important, but like that stuff is kind of persisting despite like the just like massive increase in home values, the like pretty much total lack of home building. Like thoughts about luxury condos aside, which is like that's another thing that we can talk about, but Columbia Heights hasn't built like affordable housing. Like we're not even using like housing production trust fund dollars in DC to build deeply affordable housing in Mount Pleasant. I think I said Columbia Heights wrong, because what has happened is that there has been a lot of building, and as a result, more affordable housing constructed in Columbia Heights right next door. So this entire article is like Columbia Heights erasure, like much more dynamic, much more, I would say, maintained a sort of more stable split of like racial diversity. Certainly not perfect, but if you're going to compare anything to Mount Pleasant, it's its next door neighbor, Columbia Heights, which Mount Pleasant residents have tried so hard to avoid an association with it. They want their kids sent to a different school halfway across the city. And that's where the affordable housing is, not in Mount Pleasant. The co-ops on Mount Pleasant Street are a limited, very respectable, but very limited amount of affordable housing. And to create more co-ops requires more money. And, you either build housing or you don't. People are still going to move to Mount Pleasant, and people are still going to move to Columbia Heights. And one of those has done a better job than the other at constructing things.
More with Alex Baca in just a moment, but first, a little bit of housekeeping. Episodes 4 and 5 are going to be dropping pretty soon. They are already recorded. I just need to finish editing them. They're going to drop as soon as they're ready. We don't have a set schedule for releasing new episodes yet. So I quickly want to encourage you to subscribe to the show. The main place this show lives is on YouTube, but if you're interested in the audio-only version of the show, we are now on Apple Podcasts. We are on Google Podcasts. We've got an RSS feed. We've got a lot of great content coming your way, so you're really going to want to subscribe to make sure that you see it, including some YouTube-exclusive bonus content. So even if you're listening to the podcast, you're going to want to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Subscribing is completely free. It'll keep you up to date whenever we have a new video available. And if you aren't already, following our Twitter account at The NABE Show is a great way to keep up with everything that we have going on. Okay, without further ado, let's get back to our interview with Alex. Yeah, and it's perverse how it's described in the article to me, where they talk about this laundromat that is going to be turned into condos, and sort of in a distressing way, like, oh, this is a sign that maybe the neighborhood is actually going down this path of gentrification. Could you tell us like a little bit about that and the role of the historic? I mean, what's the name of the organization? The Historic Commission or the Historic?
So Historic Mount Pleasant had pushed against this building, I think not out of anything other than it's in a building and they didn't want it. But I will give a huge credit to our advisory neighborhood commission. DC has a network, a level of like hyperlocal government called advisory neighborhood commissions. They each commissioner represents about 2,000 residents. There's like a couple hundred of them in the city. The wards are broken down into ANCs, which are split up into single member districts. I like them, and I think that they have a lot of value because they basically absorb the role that private homeowners and civic associations would fill in the absence of the system. So while it's like not perfect, it is, I think, better to have publicly elected officials, even though they're unpaid and part-time, like making these decisions than just like private civic associations. So all that said, huge props to the Mount Pleasant ANC, which worked really hard on like pushing the developer of this project to like do more and stick it out through the community process, which was contentious, and was very supportive of asking the Board of Zoning Adjustment to basically drop a parking requirement, so that the trade-off was, if we don't make you build the parking, if we help you get the variance to drop the parking, will you build another unit, which will then require you to build another inclusionary zoning unit? So, I mean, this is just like how crazy it is to build any housing or any affordable housing whatsoever, is that we're like, oh my God, the 9-unit building will have 2 IZ units and they dropped the parking requirement and this is amazing. And the ANC did such great work, which is all totally true. And just like such a scarcity mindset that it's really up. But anyway, that's what you get. So historic Mount Pleasant, which is probably pretty great at helping people understand like what kind of like period accurate like shutters and go on their house, and like helping people understand like where to buy like the right kind of siding, because like you can't use vinyl siding, like all that kind of crap. Itself its own aesthetic kind of thing, was like really opposed to the parking variance. And I did very little work on this. I just paid attention and also testified at a hearing to just be like, drop the fucking parking requirement. It's fine. I live in a 40-unit building with no parking on Mount Pleasant Street. It's fine. It's 3 blocks from the metro. There's like 3 bus lines.
And it seems like pretty outside the scope of like a historic preservation organization to like care about the parking requirements. Like the historic things that are being preserved are not like a new parking garage.
It's pointless. It was specious, and like it's so stupid to use that development as some sort of like, ooh, like the rich people are creeping in. Like the rich people are already inside the neighborhood. I don't like who the cares about like a glass box condo on Mount Pleasant Street? Like probably not most people.
Yeah, and again, it's like this is a condo that was going to happen anyway, and the variance was to create an additional affordable housing unit. And the alternative to not building anything is that there's like a laundromat there, which is, not really doing much for anyone.
The laundromat has its uses. I will say, I am sure there's a lot of like apartment buildings that are not well equipped with laundry facilities, but there's also a second laundromat on Mount Pleasant Street. So I think all of these are fine. It would have been probably fine if it stayed a laundromat, but I mean, my understanding was that like the laundromat was not, like the building owner was not super interested in this and they sold it. And that's what you get when somebody owns a building and they sell it. So, it's fine. And the fight was stupid and it's not a good example. It's just not. And I think that's the problem with this article, is that it is like full of things that are like bad examples and poor examples and wrong examples. And even the stuff that it does well, like talks about TOPA, like doesn't really talk about how to expand that to the rest of the city. I mean, if we were to take this seriously, like what does resisting gentrification actually look like? Like, I don't think I have an answer to that.
Well, I think if you took the article seriously, it would be stuff like getting the signatures, against the new CVS opening, or patronizing local businesses, I suppose would be a more generous interpretation, which like all seems fine, but I think gets at this like, again, I don't want to like pick on this specific article too much, because it's, at the end of the day, it's like one article by a random guy who is, not clearly not that well informed, I guess. But I think this like gets to like a larger issue about how people think about gentrification and how people in cities kind of view stopping it, or view what that would look like. And to take Mount Pleasant, which seems like a very unsuccessful example of stopping gentrification in terms of housing prices, and holding it up as like a model to be emulated, which the article says a couple times. I mean, they use that word, model, to be emulated. Like, I think that gets at something that's a real problem in cities.
Yeah, I mean, there is, as it's like this constant sort of like toggling back and forth of wanting to say that like, okay, I acknowledge that this is how we talk about gentrification, and we do want to make space for people's lived experiences. And like, as much as I want to on someone thinking that like signing a petition like stopped a CVS from coming and therefore like save the neighborhood, like I need that political energy to be like deployed into other stuff. So like, the hardest part is to get people to show up. So once they're there, like where do you direct their energy? And if like, historically, for a lot of neighborhoods in Mount Pleasant, which is basically like the DC version of Suleiman Osman's The Invention of Brownstone Brooklyn, right? Like of these sort of like grand old homes that are fixed up by people who have this like sense of community and really want to restore things, but then they just end up like elevating the value of stuff. Like there is a little thread like to the like political activism of that. And like I feel like that's not really like teased out enough. And that's what articles like this could actually be good at. It is saying like, okay, well, here's all this stuff. Like, what do we do? Like, what happens when you can't do TOPA in a building like mine anymore because it's too expensive and the tenants are too stressed out and can't get organized because organizing is hard. Like, we're having all these conversations about like, oh, like housing after COVID. Like, well, is anybody having like a serious conversation about maybe letting like landlords default and cities buy the buildings that they own the property? Like, public land acquisition could go a long way. Building more affordable housing could go a long way. Buy rate affordable housing tied to a zoning increase could go a long way. But it's like nobody wants to talk about that because it's a lot more fun to say that Mount Pleasant has resisted gentrification because I go drink at Mark's Cafe. Like, I like drinking at Mark's Cafe. The last time I was there, I think they started giving me free drinks after my like fourth beer. That doesn't have anything to do with gentrification. That has a lot to do with me spending money at the bar.
Yeah, and it's like this collapse of these two different things where it's like this homeowner protection of the neighborhood and these neighborhood amenities that matter to homeowners, along with like actual community activism that would help people stay in their homes, and like pretending that they're the same thing or pretending that they're equivalent processes. I think it's something that happens a lot, especially in liberal cities in wealthier neighborhoods, where a lot of people who want to protect their home values also want to pretend that they're doing good work.
Yeah, I mean, Mount Pleasant has resisted gentrification is like a really convenient narrative if you want to believe something about the neighborhood that you live in that just isn't true, so that you can let yourself off the hook. I mean, another thing, and I thought about this when you were talking about the school stuff, is that every once in a while there's sort of like bubble up about like, what police district does Mount Pleasant want to be in? Because there like has like frequently been the sort of like allegations that like Columbia Heights and Petworth are too high crime, that Mount Pleasant isn't getting the attention that they want. So it's like, okay, fantastic. We have all these like stores still around and like we have all the restaurants. Like, that's lovely, but like you have residents who are chiefly like looking after themselves and they're mostly white and like, they're mostly the most vocal ones about the public safety and school stuff, which I find to be just like heinous. Like, if you want to like be a little bit like less white supremacist, you could maybe like not push super hard for your kids to go to Wilson, or like argue that the cops aren't like paying enough attention to you. Like, I don't know.
I mean, anyone who's gone to a public meeting knows what, if someone in a wealthy neighborhood is talking about an adjacent high crime neighborhood, like that's a dog whistle for something very specific in most cases.
Right. So I think it's just like it's bad framing, but it lets everybody off the hook, right? Like, so when you are actually starting to look at public policy, like that means that like you can't just talk about this stuff as like a solution for something that won't bother you personally. Like, if Mount Pleasant hasn't resisted gentrification, and like if you were going to seriously continue to commodify both like businesses and people and say that like I feel better when my neighborhood has more Black residents and more Latino residents, like, but those people can't move there unless they are sort of like either moving in with friends and family, or they get really lucky and a spot in a co-op opens up, or maybe they're living nearby in Columbia Heights but not actually in Mount Pleasant. Like, if you want to tokenize people like so as to feel good about the state of your neighborhood, and you're not willing to like acknowledge what it means to own a house that's probably valued at over $1 million, like, that's just like you're just like your brain is talking past each other, and it's just gross. It's just gross, and it has nothing to do with the actual mechanics of like building affordable housing, which requires building it and subsidizing it, which requires taxing people more, which requires substantial government intervention, which requires vouchers, which requires like taking up more land to build family size units. It means more density. It means more apartment buildings. And like, maybe you can build that. Maybe you can give somebody a voucher to move into an existing property. But like, it requires more money and it requires more denser buildings. And people in Mount Pleasant have historically not wanted that, but they are willing to fetishize Mount Pleasant Street and the businesses on it and the people who live there who don't look like them as things that make them feel better and take away their impact. And like, you for that.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a really like an undercurrent of throughout the whole piece, like the idea that the people in the neighborhood who were there before the neighborhood gentrified need to be preserved as like this museum piece rather than as like for their own sake, which I think is hard to get away from.
I think, there's a like, I'm not interviewing tenants in Mount Pleasant, and I don't feel like I can expertly speak to what people's needs and wants are. But I can tell you that there's a pretty strong migration pattern, like into and out of the district, into like Montgomery County and Prince George's County around Langley Park and Hyattsville, where lots of people's families move and settle. There was a big wave of Salvadoran immigration in the 80s and 90s, I guess starting in the 70s actually, to Mount Pleasant. And like, cool, it's great that Ercilia serves great pupusas and it's across the street from me, but like, we're not really like, we don't have a range of housing choices in Mount Pleasant. It's either like an apartment building on Mount Pleasant Street, or it's a single family house that you probably can't afford. There are some condos, rarely though, and there are group houses. And actually, like, interestingly enough, there's a group house that's mentioned in this piece, Lemont Street Collective, that I don't think the author realized was actually displaced from its Lemont Street location. It was a long-standing group house. Lots of people would apply to it. They were, they had like yoga classes and like random shows and like stuff that I like kind of make fun of because it's like a little bit excessive, like for me. But like, people liked having that in Mount Pleasant, and so they're in Parkview now, and they've rebranded as Love and Solidarity Collective because the owner of the property wanted to move back in. So again, like it's like half the story is missing in this piece, but it's also like half the story being missing, and like this like deliberate sort of like choice of cutting off context and like denying people agency and turning businesses into things, like actually really pervades a lot of housing politics, I think, especially for homeowners. And so instead of talking about money or what it would take to like maintain some level of affordability, or should all of these gigantic houses, like the houses in Mount Pleasant, like back towards the park, are also like enormous. They're huge. Houses on Park Road were built for like families with servants. Like, it's up. And like, those are huge houses for affluent families. Like, there's one of them that's been broken up into condos, and it's probably like a good thing, I guess. But like, there's a really limited amount of options in Mount Pleasant. So if your life changes, or if your family changes, or like if your living situation changes, or you get a different job, like you're gonna have to work to stay there if you even want to. And this sort of like Mount Pleasant as a construct, or Mount Pleasant as a good to be consumed, basically, like is like who really thinks like that, besides like people like us who like are sort of in these positions of like chattering and media and stuff. Like, that's not a normal thing for people to think. They're thinking about the schools and crime and like how much time it takes them to get to and from work, and are they near their family, like are they proximate to things that matter. They're thinking about childcare and healthcare, not this like, and I can say this because I have a cultural studies degree, not this like, what does the neighborhood signify? And so much of the writing about gentrification like comes from people coming out of like sociology, like with the sort of like ethnographic research background that I myself was trained in, to like write about basically like, whether these neighborhoods. And it's just stupid. It's just a stupid way of thinking about this stuff. Like, it's fun. I love making fun of stuff, but it's just stupid.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a real dynamic where like by the time the kind of people who like write a cultural study of a neighborhood are moving into that neighborhood, like that is itself gentrification, like almost definitionally.
Yeah, I mean, I recommend Brett Williams' Upscaling Downtown to lots and lots of people. It's very short. It's kind of hard to get a copy of it. But it's a sort of thinly veiled, and she doesn't call it Mount Pleasant, but it's like obviously Mount Pleasant. Where she's talking about like basically like white people, like young white professionals, like moving into Mount Pleasant and functionally like flipping houses. A lot of like old houses there were SROs or boarding houses, just like pretty slummy, like not the intentional community group house, but just like I need a room to sleep in, like while I go labor, like especially like in the 40s and 50s when like the covenants started to be like broken through a little bit. There's a little bit more about Mount Pleasant in Shirley Tiller Hazlitt's Sweeter the Juice, about how her family like had lived there, and what the neighborhood was like. And it was just kind of like, it was its own suburb. I think that's an important thing to remember, is that there was a streetcar that connected Mount Pleasant to downtown, so that you did have a variety of for incomes there, but like, it was super segregated on its own, and there's still a lot of wealth there.
Yeah, and to your point, like I saw this this tweet, which I'll post as a slide. The population of Mount Pleasant was down like 1,000 people from 2010 to 2000, like because a lot of de-densification had actually happened, with people flipping houses or people taking, rentals that might hold a larger family and then flipping them into a single family home. And at the same time, from 1999 to 2010, the average family income in Mount Pleasant went up $40,000, from $90,000 to $130,000.
Yeah, I mean, people are buying houses in Mount Pleasant because they can't afford them in Cleveland Park, or they can't afford them in Adams Morgan. Like, not necessarily, and the schools are zoned for Wilson, and like it's a cute neighborhood with like great. I mean, like, I love being across the street from Each Peach. I buy a lot of my groceries there. The products are insufferable, but like it is like everything a bougie grocery store might have. But like it's great. Like it's there. Like, like there's a library down the end of the street. Like I do go to the Best World sometimes. Like I like the bars. I liked the pizza that cost me $21. Like I have no issue with that. I can pay that. It was delicious. I'll be honest, I also buy a lot of my groceries at the Target at DC USA because they're cheaper there, and like you can order pickup on the app. So like, what is really the more I think like proletarian option in there? It's like the Target, the CVS, the Best Buy, like even like the Cava, like over on 14th Street, like that is a little bit more expansive than what's going on in Mount Pleasant, which is just like really precious all of the time.
Yeah, I mean, like this is something that you see in places like Malibu or like the Hamptons, these like chain store bans, and it's not like a working class friendly thing. It's like to protect the aesthetics of these resort communities. Like, to see the article posited as like this anti-gentrification measure, I think is like, I mean, naive would be the generous interpretation, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about the aesthetics of a neighborhood, I think that is a perfectly fine thing to delve into and unpack. But just to kind of like connect that to gentrification is irresponsible. And by running that in the post, it sort of like allows other people to let themselves off the hook, I think. Like that's the worst case scenario, is that somebody reads this stuff and is like, okay, well, I'm doing fine. I can oppose the condo on Mount Pleasant Street. And it's just like, that's not the direction that stuff needs to be going in. I mean, if, like I said, like I was ranting about it, but like the places in the DC housing system, as one might say, that like are tied to actual, I think, impacts on displacement that can sort of like staunch that are the programs in our budget that give people money, right? So we have an emergency rental assistance program. We have a low income rent supplement program. That's our local voucher program. Like, those are things that get people to cash to people to afford housing so they can stay. TOPA allows you to organize by your building. You can turn it into a co-op if you wish, although that's actually not a requirement. That's great. There is a rent stabilization policy in DC that's being debated right now. I live in a rent stabilized unit. Like, those are things that we could talk about. We could talk more about public acquisition of buildings. We could talk more about, getting things under the ownership of either CLTs or the public sector. We could talk more about subsidizing stuff, but that requires like getting people money and building people more. And none of that, I think I've said this a million times, but like none of that is present in this article. And that's just such a huge bummer, because like we're gonna come into like a really tight budget season, not just in DC and in other cities, and social services and housing are gonna be perceived as a thing to be cut. I mean, I have testimony going back years saying to like defund MPD or defund like pointless mayoral appointments to like pay for more housing. Like that's like a pretty common thing. That's not zeitgeisty. That's like a potential source of like a lot of money for this. But that is a political option. Budgets are to some degree fixed every year, and you do have to allocate money and make those choices, and that's a political process.
Alex, thank you so much for joining me.
Of course, thanks. I will talk to you soon.
So there you have it. That's the bad article. Is this the worst article that's ever been written about gentrification? Probably not, but it is still not great. Thank you again to Alex Baca for coming on the show, and thank you, as always, for watching. Alex also gave us a very detailed tour of Mount Pleasant Street's bougie businesses, but unfortunately we had to cut that for time, so I'm going to post that later this week on the YouTube channel as bonus content. Make sure you're following the Twitter account and subscribe to the YouTube channel so you won't miss it. Links to all of those are going to be in the episode description. Next time on the NABE, I couldn't avoid it any longer. We finally had to do it. The popular demand was too great. You'd all write into the show saying, why aren't you doing a Mayor Pete episode? Where is our Mayor Pete content? Well, worry no more. Episode 4 and episode 5. We're talking Mayor Pete. We're talking the United States Department of Transportation. It's a Secretary Pete two-parter. I'm going to post those episodes just as soon as I have them ready. I will see you next time.